Thank you everyone for your responses. And we move on into part 2, which is implementing the ESS. Great. So Celeste would have given you all a very good overview of what environmental and social safeguards are. And then Mario, of course, gave us some very in-depth information on how we work towards considering them through the CEC process. So we're going to now go into a little bit more on how we think about environmental and social safeguards, of what they mean, and how we're really going to implement those safeguards and at the project level. So the first and foremost, we really want to consider intersectional approaches when we're thinking about the ESS. And what does that mean? So for those who haven't heard about an intersectional approach before, it's essentially a way of understanding how multiple factors can compound people's experiences and also then therefore contribute to what the risks might be and how they're exposed to a project or a situation. So those factors can be gender, they can be age, disability, income and economic status, geography and location, and a combination of those things as well, right? That would shape people's experiences and their exposure to risks and hazards. And so that intersectional approach, when we take that, it allows us to recognize some of the overlapping and unique risks and disadvantages that some groups might face and it helps us essentially move beyond that one size fits all approach, right? We're not thinking about in this context of this project, we're not thinking about the persons in the SORB region as one homogeneous group based on their geographic location alone. We're considering their unique experiences as farmers, fishers, working persons, parents, mothers, school children, etc. And so why does this matter when we're considering social safeguards? Because people experience the environment differently, and therefore the social impacts it has on them are different, right? The experiences that a child faces walking to school are unique, and there's the experiences that farmers face as well are unique based on the type, what they're farming and where they're working. And so projects that overlook intersectionality, therefore, can often unintentionally exclude persons and actually create unintended negative impacts on these vulnerable groups, right? When we're not looking to see how we can meet their needs. So that intersectional lens helps us ensure that the safeguards we put in place through things like the management plans, the gender action plans, the grievance response mechanisms, which we're all going to talk about from now until the end of our workshop, are inclusive, fair, and responsive, and essentially help us make sure that what we're delivering from a project is sustainable, equitable, and community-driven. Next slide, Celeste. So this diagram, this is from the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And, one thing I encourage us all to do here is ESS, it has to be a unique process, but we also don't want to rewrite the mold, right? There's tools that are existing that can help us. And in this workshop, we're bringing that to you. We're also talking about the unique perspective of the SORB project. And then we're also going to be sending you all home with several handouts as well at the end that you can use. But there's a lot of stuff existing that we can help, that helps us understand what we need to do and how we need to do it. And so this figure is one of those things. It shows us what we need to think about in an adaptation cycle. And it shows us the process of starting with the orange, the impact and vulnerability assessment. So thinking about those intersectional experiences and how that then feeds into our planning processes, how we implement our projects, and then of course, how we monitor and evaluate our projects. And then what we learn from those evaluations goes right back into our impact assessments. And that cycle continues so we can continuously ensure that what we're doing is having the intended impacts and that if there are any negative impacts that we're addressing those. And within that process, there are key principles, some of which Celeste talked about before: accessibility and inclusion, making sure that things are context specific, making sure that our activities are deliberate, and that we're, of course, engaging and learning from the community and reflecting on our position and how that impacts what we do. And then there's really some overall foundational principles as well that underscore all of these things at the bottom we can see, which is that we have to center the people who are in situations of vulnerability. We have to have a systemic approach to this. We have to stay focused on the agencies that can assist us. And this one here, addressing power. What this means is we have to think about the potential power imbalances, where we stand as project implementers and organizations and institutions in comparison to where the community stands, and how do we address that power imbalance? How do we make sure that we are not dictating and that we are including and learning from? So this is really what we consider. Next slide. So the first way that we implement social safeguards in a project is through our ESMPs, our Environmental and Social Management Plan. At the SORB project, as the ESS specialist, the ESMP is like my religious text, right? This is what I use. And it's a growing document. It's an ever-evolving document. It comes from the initial risk assessment that happens in the project planning phases, and then it is continuously updated throughout the project as the project itself evolves, so that we can continue to make sure that we're responding to what we need to do. So what are the ESMPs? The ESMP is a strategic plan that outlines how we're going to manage our environmental and our social risks. This is important because it's helping us ensure that we are hitting our compliance goals, that we're making sure that the environmental and social safeguards are integrated into the project activities on time.
Sorry, I pressed something.
And continuously. It also helps us make sure that we can mitigate risks, right? That we can identify the risks and outline our mitigation measures, and then minimize the adverse effects. And then for our SORB project, we have our ESMP that guides all of our activities. But if we're looking specifically, for example, at our flood management actions, it's ensuring that the infrastructure that we put in place doesn't disrupt the local ecosystems, does not disrupt the livelihoods of the farmers who are there, and thinks about those people, but instead enhances the positive benefits, and that we therefore have to have consultations with them to make sure that we're doing that. Next slide. So there's phases to this. Like I said, there's the planning phase, which is critical. This is when we do our risk assessment. We have our consultations with key persons that inform us. We find reports, we get the available research, we bring all of these things together, and this is what informs our design in the early phases. Then comes our procurement. So when the project is being executed, every time somebody is brought on board, you say to them, these are our environmental and social expectations for your project, for your contract, for your activity, right? We set those out from the beginning and make sure that everybody's informed from the top to the bottom. Then there's the implementation. So there's the guidance of the ongoing activities, the environmental and social management and supervision. Then of course comes the monitoring phase, where we're tracking that compliance, updating our mitigation measures based on what has happened, right? Sometimes you have unforeseen changes, you have unforeseen results, and so we update and we continue. The ESMP, the way it can be used, it can be a standalone. So a standalone ESMP might be for projects that have just moderate risks identified. And then Mario spoke a little bit about the ESIAs, which are necessary for the higher risk and complex projects as well. And this is where that ESIA will be worked in with the ESMP. And then you can also have thematic or activity specific plans based on what you're doing. So this might just mean a waste management plan that corresponds with a project, a community health and safety plan, or whatever is deemed relevant. And so who is involved in this process from the beginning to the end, the planning to the monitoring? Of course, you have the ESS specialists. You have subject matter experts as well, because the ESS specialist is not an expert on all things. So they consult with the other specialists on the project who can better speak to the activity itself and what might happen. You consult with them and you involve them in the planning. Then, of course, you're involving, as we said, the contractors, who might be the construction and engineering people. And then, of course, you have M&E consultants as well. It's important to have persons who are dedicated to the monitoring and evaluation, which should be done both internally within a project and externally as well. There's a time for external evaluation, so we can make sure we have an unbiased perspective on what is happening. Next slide. So Mario spoke already about ESIAs within the context of the EMA, but ESIAs can also happen outside of CEC application processes. Oftentimes projects will conduct their own ESIAs in the planning phases, as that first risk assessment. And that informs the ESMPs and whatever might come after. So the ESIA is essentially to assess the potential for environmental and social impacts of a project before it begins. This is important because we have to identify the risks, both positive and negative, right? Allowing for preventative measures and also measures that can maximize identified benefits. It's critical in this phase that there is stakeholder engagement, ensuring that the affected communities are consulted and that their concerns are addressed. And an example of this in the SORB project is we can conduct, when we're implementing our activities, we'll be conducting ongoing consultations that are kind of contributing to the ongoing impact assessment that help us understand how flood management infrastructure might affect local ecosystems and communities. For example, we consider how a river course change could impact aquatic species and community livelihoods. Next slide. So the phases of ESIA, I'll kind of just speed through this one because we've talked about it at length, but just as a reminder, we're thinking about the feasibility and design, we're thinking about our approvals, and then we're thinking about our planning and how that feeds into the ESMP. There's uses, there's the full ESIA for large and high-risk projects. There are also initial environmental examinations, which might be for moderate risk projects, strategic assessments for policies, plans, and programs, and also the cumulative assessments, which are when multiple projects in a region might have interacting impacts. So who's involved? The ESS experts, environmental scientists, social and gender experts as well, because the social impacts are critical, health and safety specialists, economics and land use planners, stakeholder engagement facilitators, as well as the stakeholders themselves, of course, and then the governing bodies. And this list is not closed. This is extensive. It is really just a matter of who needs to be in the room. And the goal is to make that list as broad as possible in this process. Next slide. So another element of the ESS process is the gender action plans. GAPS and GESI-SAPs, right? GAPS is gender action plans. The GESI-SAP, which is kind of an extended version of this, is a gender equality, social inclusion, and safeguarding action plan. And so what are these, right? The GAP, if you're dealing with just a GAP, and the reason why there's two different ones, by the way, is because depending on who is rolling out a project, what the funding requires, oftentimes what is asked for is by a funder, by a project implementer, or even just what is needed can vary. And so there's different versions of this. So a GAP, the Gender Action Plan alone, focuses on addressing gender disparities, in projects and making sure that we're being gender responsive, gender inclusive, and gender sensitive in things that we do. The GESI-SAP goes beyond just gender and ensures the inclusivity of vulnerable and marginalized groups, considers social, cultural, and economic factors. And so I would say even in instances where you see a project that has a GAP, a gender action plan, oftentimes you will get elements of that GESI-SAP in there where we're thinking beyond, again, just the gender and thinking about the vulnerability of certain groups in the context of the project. And that's definitely what we're doing with the SORB project as well. So why is this important? Because we need to make sure that everything we do is inclusive and responds to the needs of certain groups, individuals, those who are more vulnerable. And therefore, it makes sure that the benefits that come out of the project are as equitable as possible. And then empowerment as well. We're focusing on increasing the participation of certain groups that are found based on the initial risk assessments to be more at risk. So this might include, depending on a context, women, disabled individuals, and other underrepresented groups in the decision making. And so in the SORB project, for example, our GAP, our Gender Action Plan, ensures that vulnerable groups, including women farmers in the SORB region, do have access to capacity building activities in everything we do. Next slide. So the phases of this essentially mirror those of the ESS, the ESMP and ESIA. We have the design through implementation, through monitoring. We also do capacity building with this as well, because there is some learning and training that happens around this, the GAP and GESI-SAPs. They can be standalone, they can be integrated, they can be sector specific. And then who is involved? Again, it's everybody from the specialists and experts to the community, to civil society and local NGOs, as well as critical here. And then it can also include state level, stakeholders. Next slide. And so the third element here we need to think about in implementation is our M&E, our monitoring and evaluation. So what is M&E? M&E tracks the progress of implementing the environmental and social safeguards, ensuring that the objectives are met and the impacts are understood. Why is it important? I think we all know. To ensure effectiveness, it helps us evaluate the effectiveness of mitigation strategies and ensures that basically we're following through on what we're saying we're going to do. And it also allows us to continuously, improve so that we can ensure that not that we're not just doing what we're said that we're going to do, but that when we look at what we've done, assess the impact that it's had, we can make sure that we adjust, right? Realign the upcoming activities to make sure that we're having the intended impacts we want to have. So for example, at the SORB project, when we're doing our M&E, we're tracking flood resilience measures, including infrastructure reinforcement. We're looking at the ecosystem restoration, and we're evaluating continuously to ensure that we are reducing flood impacts, which is our ultimate goal on the community, particularly those marginalized groups. Next slide. So how is M&E used? So we're tracking implementation at all times, right? An M&E plan needs to have a laid out schedule for when we implement essentially monitoring measures. This might include forms. And by the way, one of the things we're sending you home with is an M&E checklist and further guidance on that. So if we have an M&E checklist that is specific to our project, we have an implementation plan that tells us when we need to utilize this checklist, how often we need to do it. Is it on a regularly scheduled basis? Maybe it's quarterly or annually. Or is it based on when an activity ends and when a new one begins, etc., right? And essentially, we're using that to monitor compliance with our ESMP, as well as our gaps and GESISAPs and any other plans that we have that are overarching for our project. It's a performance-based assessment, so it measures the progress against targets and indicators that are developed in the planning phase, in that ESMP phase. And it's also, and it allows us to adapt, right? To adjust our plans based on the findings. And then of course to report, which is key for accountability. So we're reporting not just to the project team, project funders, but we're also reporting to the community, right? What have we found? What have we done? What have you told us? And what are we going to do as we continue? This is critical when you're doing the M&E process. And so, as I said, there are types of M&E, including the internal and external. Internal, of course, being those conducted by the project team, and then external being the independent evaluations and third parties who look at it from a much more objective perspective based on the reports produced by the project. And then lastly, it's critical to have the M&E process be participatory so that we involve our communities and our stakeholders throughout the process. And then again, we're being transparent in sharing those reports with them when they come out. So who's involved? The M&E specialists, the ESS experts, the data analysts, the community liaison officers as well, who are facilitating that ongoing transparent relationship, and any other persons who are required by the project to be. Next slide. All right, we'll pause here for